You think you know who you are. But what if that certainty is an illusion? What if the person you call me is not a solid truth, but a shifting story, a narrative stitched together by memory, culture, and fleeting emotion? Here's the unsettling reality. The self is not something you own, it's something you constantly invent. And the moment you try to hold it still, it slips away. Pause on that for a moment. Who are you really? Are you the voice in your head right now, listening to these words? Are you the body you see in the mirror, the habits you repeat, the memories you carry? Or are you the person others believe you to be, the version of you that lives in their minds? And if all of these are partly true, then which one is the real you? We've all felt it, that eerie flicker of alienation when you hear your own voice recorded and think, that doesn't sound like me. Or when you look back at your younger self 5 years, 10 years, 20 years ago, and feel like you're staring at a stranger. If that past version was truly you, why do you feel so distant from them now? And if your future self will someday look back at who you are today with the same bewilderment, what does that say about the you claim to know? This is the paradox of self-knowledge. It is both the most important journey you can take and the one destination you can never fully arrive at. The unexamined life, Socrates warned, is not worth living. Yet the more we examine, the more unstable the ground beneath us feels. To know yourself deeply is to recognize just how little you truly know. Thinkers across centuries have wrestled with this. Nietzsche declared, "Become who you are." But how can you become what you cannot define? Jung insisted that we must confront the shadow, the hidden parts of ourselves we deny. Kierkegaard saw despair not simply as suffering, but as the sickness of not being aligned with your true self. And yet, each of these thinkers, in their own way, acknowledged the same haunting truth. The self is not a fixed object, but a mystery in motion. So why does this matter to you? Because whether you realize it or not, every decision you make, every relationship you nurture, every dream you chase is shaped by your idea of who you are. And if that idea is incomplete, or worse, an illusion, then the life you're living might not be entirely yours. Let me tell you a story. Elias was a man who had everything that looked like success. His career was stable, his friends admired him, his family respected him. By all external measures, he was living well. One night, walking past a shop window, he caught his reflection. He stopped. Something about the man staring back at him felt foreign. The suit, the tired smile, the hurried steps. For reasons he couldn't explain, he thought, is this really me? Or is this just a role I've been playing? That brief moment shook him more deeply than years of routine ever had. It wasn't depression, it wasn't failure, it was the sudden awareness that he didn't fully know himself. Have you had a moment like that? When the life you're living suddenly feels like a mask? When you wonder if you're pursuing your own desires or just carrying out someone else's script? Those cracks and certainty aren't flaws in your life, they're glimpses into the paradox itself. Modern psychology echoes this. Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist who reshaped our understanding of decision-making, showed that most of what we do doesn't come from slow, rational thought, but from fast, intuitive processes. We act first, then justify later. Your mind tells you a story about why you did something, but much of the real cause lies beneath conscious awareness. Add to that our biases, our shifting moods, our unconscious drives, and the idea that you fully know yourself starts to unravel. And yet, you keep searching. Why? Because to live without reflection is to drift. To know yourself, even imperfectly, is to live with intention. Kierkegaard once wrote that the self is a relation relating itself to itself. Strange words, but powerful. The self isn't a thing, it's a dynamic process, always in tension between who you are and who you might become. That means knowing yourself is less like finding a finished answer and more like reading a story as it unfolds. The paradox isn't a problem to solve, but a truth to live with. The goal is not to pin yourself down, but to become conscious of the forces shaping you, so that you can participate in the process rather than sleepwalking through it. And that is what we're here to explore together. Over the next half hour, we'll journey into this paradox. Why the self is unknowable yet worth seeking. How philosophy and psychology both illuminate and complicate the quest, and why embracing uncertainty might be the key to freedom. Along the way, you'll be invited to reflect on your own life, your contradictions, your hidden depths, your unrealized possibilities. Because this is not just an abstract puzzle. It's about you. And before we go further, let me say this. If these questions stir something in you, if you feel the tug of recognition in what we're exploring, I invite you to stay connected beyond this moment. Think of subscribing not as a formality, but as stepping deeper into this ongoing conversation. Because the search for self-knowledge is not a solitary project. It's one we navigate together, exchanging perspectives, doubts, and insights. So let's go further. If the self is elusive, why should we care? Why chase something we can never fully grasp? The answer, as we'll see, is that the very act of searching reshapes who we are. To confront the paradox of knowing yourself is to embrace growth, to step into freedom, and to live with a depth that comfort and certainty can never provide. And that brings us to the next step. If the self is unstable, where do we even begin the search? The story, as you'll see, goes much deeper than mirrors, memories, or modern psychology. It stretches all the way back to the oldest questions humanity has ever asked. We left off with a question. If the self is unstable, where does the search begin? The first temptation is to look inside. After all, isn't that what self-knowledge means? Turning inward, reflecting, examining your thoughts and feelings? But here's where the paradox deepens. Because the more you turn inward, the more you realize that the very tools you use to examine yourself, the mind, memory, and emotions, are themselves unreliable narrators. Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher, is remembered as one of the earliest champions of self-examination. He didn't write books or present grand systems of thought. Instead, he wandered the streets of Athens asking people questions that disarmed them. What is justice? What is virtue? What does it mean to live well? He frustrated people not by giving them answers, but by exposing how little they actually knew about themselves and their beliefs. When he said, "Know thyself," he wasn't offering a simple maxim. He was pointing to a lifelong practice, a confrontation with ignorance. But Socrates also knew something we often forget. We are experts at deceiving ourselves. You can convince yourself you are kind, when in reality you are generous only when it is convenient. You can believe you are courageous, while avoiding every difficult truth. You can tell yourself you are rational, when in fact you are rationalizing. Socratic self-knowledge wasn't about building a flattering self-image. It was about stripping away illusions until you faced something raw and unsettling. Ask yourself, when was the last time you realized you had been lying to yourself? Maybe about a relationship you knew wasn't right, but clung to anyway. Maybe about a habit you insisted wasn't hurting you, though you knew it was. Maybe about the goals you chase, convincing yourself they're your own, when deep down you sense they belong to someone else's expectations. How many layers of self-deception still live in you, unnoticed? Modern psychology confirms what Socrates intuited. The mind is a master of self-deception. Freud argued that the unconscious hides from us truths we don't want to face. Jung expanded this, insisting that each of us carries a shadow, those parts of ourselves we deny or repress. We bury anger because we want to appear gentle. We hide selfishness because we want to appear noble. We cover fear with arrogance, insecurity with bravado. But the shadow never disappears. It leaks out in ways we don't expect, shaping our lives in the dark. Think about someone who explodes in anger over a trivial slight, or someone who is endlessly critical of others for faults they secretly fear in themselves, or even someone who preaches morality while hiding corruption. The shadow doesn't vanish simply because you ignore it. Jung's warning was simple. Unless you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That sentence should haunt us, because it suggests that much of what we take to be our true selves may, in fact, be the unexamined influence of what we refuse to see. If you've ever sabotaged yourself, hurt someone you love without knowing why, or repeated mistakes that seem to come from nowhere, then you've felt the shadow's pull. But here's where the paradox sharpens. To truly know yourself, you must face your shadow. But facing it changes you. Once you acknowledge the anger, fear, or selfishness within, You are no longer the same person you were before. Self-knowledge reshapes the self, which means the very act of knowing yourself alters the object you are trying to know. It's like trying to draw a map of a landscape that shifts as you move across it. This is why Kierkegaard insisted that the self is not a static thing, but a dynamic relationship. You are not a fixed identity, you simply uncover. You're a possibility, a becoming. Every moment you reflect, every decision you make, pulls you into a new version of yourself. And that means knowing yourself is never about arriving at a final answer. It's about living within the tension of change. Consider another story. A woman named Clara always thought of herself as shy. From childhood into adulthood, she carried this belief like a badge. I'm the quiet one. It shaped her friendships, her career choices, even her sense of possibility. But one day, invited to give a talk at work, she surprised herself. She spoke passionately with clarity and authority. Colleagues were impressed. And for the first time, Clara glimpsed another self, a self who wasn't shy but bold. That single moment cracked open the story she had told herself for decades. Who was she really, the shy one or the bold one? The answer, of course, is both and neither. She wasn't uncovering a hidden truth, so much as stepping into a new possibility. This is what the paradox demands we recognize. Self-knowledge isn't a matter of peeling back layers until you find the real you. It's a process of encountering, confronting, and reshaping yourself over and over again. You are not a noun, you are a verb. Not a thing, but a becoming. And yet, despite this fluidity, there is still something in us that craves stability. We want to know, who am I really? We want a foundation we can rely on. And so we create stories. The brain, neuroscientists tell us, is a storyteller by nature. It takes scattered experiences and weaves them into a coherent narrative. That narrative is what you call me. It explains your past, justifies your present, and projects your future. But coherence does not equal truth. Your brain cares less about accuracy and more about stability. It wants a story that feels whole, even if it's incomplete. This is why memory is unreliable. Psychologists have shown that every time you recall a memory, you subtly alter it. The details shift, fade, or bend to your current emotions. You don't remember the past as it was. You remember it as your present self needs it to be. Which means your life story is not a photograph album. It's a constantly edited novel. And if the story of your past changes as you change, then the self built on that story is never fixed either. Have you ever told a story from your childhood only to realize later that it wasn't quite true? That details had blurred, timelines had collapsed, emotions had been rewritten? That doesn't mean you were lying. It means your mind was doing what it always does, rewriting you into coherence. Which leads to the unsettling thought. How much of the person you think you are is simply the byproduct of a story your brain is still editing? This is where philosophy and psychology converge. Philosophy urges us to examine the narratives we live by. Psychology shows us how fragile those narratives really are. Together, they remind us. The paradox of knowing yourself is not solved by finding one final truth, but by becoming aware of how stories, shadows, and shifting memories shape you. Now pause with me here. Why does this matter? Why should you care about shadows, shifting selves, and unstable narratives? Because the way you understand yourself determines the way you live. If you believe you are static, you risk living trapped in outdated stories. If you believe you are only what others see, you risk living someone else's life. But if you embrace the paradox, that you are both knowable and unknowable, fixed and fluid, you open the door to freedom. You are no longer bound to be only what you have been. You can grow. You can change. You can create. Think of the words of Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. The Stoics taught that while the world around us is unstable, the way we relate to ourselves can bring peace. But even they knew the self was not a fortress. It was a practice, something cultivated daily. Marcus Aurelius filled his private journal with reflections, not because he thought he could capture a permanent identity, but because he knew that self-examination is never finished. So where does this leave us? At a threshold. You now see that the search for self-knowledge is not about uncovering a final truth, but about entering a dialogue between who you are, who you think you are, and who you might become. It is about facing the illusions you live by, the shadows you deny, and the stories you rewrite. And it is about choosing consciously how you will live within that paradox. But this raises an even deeper question. If the self is always changing, how do we live authentically? How do we distinguish between the selves that are masks and the selves that are real? And what does authenticity even mean in a world where the self itself is fluid? That's where we go next. Because the paradox of knowing yourself doesn't end with the discovery of instability. It deepens into a question of freedom, authenticity, and the courage to live without final answers. We've seen that the self is unstable, more story than substance, more becoming than being. But this insight immediately confronts us with another question. If the self is fluid, how do we live authentically? What does authenticity even mean when the ground beneath us keeps shifting? Many people assume that authenticity means being true to yourself. It's a phrase we hear often, almost to the point of cliché. But think about it. If the self is constantly changing, then which version of you should you be true to? The shy Clara of her past, or the bold Clara she glimpsed in her moment of courage? The Elias who lived up to social expectations, or the Elias who suddenly felt alienated from his reflection? This is the tension at the heart of authenticity. To be true to yourself doesn't mean clinging to one unchanging identity. It means living in conscious dialogue with the selves you have been, the selves you are, and the selves you might yet become. Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist philosopher, put it starkly, "Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself." For Sartre, the essence of human life is freedom. We are not bound to a fixed identity. We are condemned, as he said, to be free. That freedom is exhilarating, but also terrifying. Because if you are free to define yourself, then you are also responsible for what you become. This is why Sartre warned against bad faith. Bad faith is when we deny our freedom by hiding behind roles, excuses, or fixed identities. It's when a waiter convinces himself he is nothing more than a waiter, or when a person insists, "That's just who I am," as if identity were a prison cell rather than a choice. Have you ever caught yourself saying that? "I can't change, that's just me"? That's the voice of bad faith. It's the refusal to face the discomfort of freedom. And here's the irony. We often cling to roles and labels because they feel safe, not realizing that in doing so we betray our deeper authenticity. Authenticity, in the existential sense, doesn't mean uncovering some eternal self. It means embracing the fact that you are not finished, that you are responsible for becoming. This is why Nietzsche's words, "Become who you are," ring with such paradox. He wasn't telling us to discover a hidden self. He was telling us to create ourselves, to live with the courage to shape meaning in a world that offers no ready-made answers. Nietzsche saw most people living what he called herd lives, repeating social scripts, avoiding discomfort, never facing the abyss of freedom. To become who you are is to refuse that, to step into the creative tension of becoming. But how do we do that? Psychology offers a clue. One of the most powerful forces shaping identity is cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort we feel when our actions don't align with our self-image. Imagine someone who thinks of themselves as honest, but then lies to a friend. The gap between belief and action creates tension. To relieve it, the person can either admit the lie and change their behavior, or they can change their self-image by rationalizing. It wasn't really a lie, it was just protecting them. Which choice leads to authenticity? You already know. Cognitive dissonance reveals something profound. Authenticity is not about having the right identity, but about aligning your actions with the identity you choose. And because you can choose differently tomorrow, authenticity is a living process, not a final state. Let me take you into another story. Marcus was a father who prided himself on being patient. He told himself, and others, that patience was his defining virtue. But one evening after a long day, he snapped at his daughter over something trivial. She looked at him with shock and hurt, and in that moment Marcus felt the dissonance. "I am patient," he thought, "yet I just lashed out. He could have rationalized it. I was tired, she was misbehaving. But instead, Marcus chose differently. He apologized. He admitted his impatience. And in that moment, he became more authentic, not because he was flawless, but because he faced the tension between who he thought he was and who he actually was. Authenticity isn't perfection. It's honesty in the face of contradiction. Now let's return to Kierkegaard, who saw despair not as sadness, but as the sickness of not being yourself. For him, despair came in two forms: not wanting to be yourself, or wanting to be yourself without God, without grounding. But beyond theology, his insight remains powerful. Despair is the refusal to face your own becoming. When you flee from yourself into distraction, conformity, or denial, you live in despair, even if outwardly you seem fine. Have you noticed how easy it is to fill your days with noise, entertainment, or endless scrolling, never stopping long enough to confront the deeper questions? That avoidance is its own form of despair. So, what does it look like to live authentically in the paradox? It looks like confronting the masks you wear, without mistaking them for the whole truth. It looks like acknowledging the shadow within, without letting it define you. It looks like accepting your freedom, even when it feels heavy. And it looks like choosing, moment by moment, to align your actions with the self you are becoming. But here's the twist. Authenticity is not only personal, it is relational. The self does not exist in isolation. Who you are is always, in part, reflected back to you by others. Think of Martin Buber's famous distinction, the I-it and the I-thou. In an I-it relationship, you treat others as objects, as means to an end. In an I-thou relationship, you encounter them as whole beings, and in doing so, you reveal yourself as well. Self-knowledge emerges not only in solitude, but in relationship. Have you noticed how others sometimes see things in you that you cannot see in yourself? Sometimes they see the best of you before you do. Sometimes they see the parts you hide. In either case, the mirror of relationship reveals. Even neuroscience confirms this. The brain has what are called mirror neurons, which fire when you see someone else act, as if you were performing the action yourself. These neurons help us empathize, but they also remind us our sense of self is never separate from others. We are social creatures wired for connection, which means that to know yourself, you cannot only look inward, you must also pay attention to how you are revealed in the presence of others. And yet, this too raises a challenge. If you are partly defined by others, how do you avoid living as a mask for their expectations? How do you balance the truths others reflect with the freedom to create yourself? This tension is not easy, but it may be the very space where authenticity lives. Let me ask you directly, have you ever felt most yourself in the presence of someone else, not because they defined you, but because they saw you without judgment? Think of a friend, a partner, a mentor who held up a mirror in which you recognized not only who you were, but who you could be. That recognition is a glimpse of authentic selfhood. It doesn't mean they gave you your identity. It means they revealed the possibility you already carried. So here we are. The paradox grows clearer. You cannot know yourself fully, yet you must still seek. You cannot be fixed, yet you must still live authentically. You cannot be entirely free of others, yet you must still create yourself. And this is where philosophy, psychology, and lived experience converge, pointing not to a solution, but to a way of living within the paradox. And as we approach the final stretch of this journey, one last question arises. If self-knowledge is incomplete, if authenticity is always in tension, what is the ultimate purpose of the search? Why wrestle with the paradox at all? The answer, I think, lies in transformation. Because the paradox doesn't just unsettle us, it changes us. And in embracing it, we may discover not who we are, but how to live with depth, meaning, and courage. That's where we turn next. The paradox of knowing yourself is not simply a philosophical puzzle. It is the foundation of growth, the path to wisdom, and perhaps even the secret to freedom. We have arrived at the threshold of the paradox. We've seen how the self is unstable, how authenticity is a dialogue between past and future, how freedom is both gift and burden, how relationships reflect us, and how psychology reveals the illusions we live by. The question that now lingers is this: if complete self-knowledge is impossible, then why does the search matter? Why not simply live without digging so deeply? The answer, I think, is transformation. The search matters not because it gives us a final truth about who we are, but because it changes the way we live. The paradox of knowing yourself is not a puzzle to solve, it is a path to walk. And on this path, you don't arrive at certainty, but you do arrive at depth. Let me explain. Imagine a river. You stand at its edge, watching the water flow. The river is never the same, yet you call it by one name. You dip your hand in, it slips through, impossible to hold, but you still feel its coolness. The self is like that river, always moving, never identical, yet still carrying a kind of continuity. To know yourself is not to freeze the river, but to learn how to stand in it, how to flow with it, how to notice the currents without mistaking them for permanence. This is what philosophy has always been pointing toward. Socrates asked questions not to trap people in uncertainty, but to awaken them to the movement of their own minds. Nietzsche urged us to create ourselves not because the self was absent, but because the self was open. Kierkegaard spoke of despair not to condemn, but to call us into alignment with possibility. Each thinker, in their own way, reminds us that the search for self-knowledge is less about arriving at answers and more about learning to live courageously in the absence of them. Psychology offers the same lesson. Consider the concept of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself through experience. This means that who you are, your habits, your patterns, your emotional responses, is not fixed. Every reflection, every choice, literally reshapes the brain. When you confront your shadow, when you act in alignment with your chosen values, when you rewrite your story consciously rather than passively, you change the neural pathways that define your sense of self. Knowing yourself is not about discovering something static, it's about participating in your own becoming. But there is also a danger here. If we embrace the fluidity of the self too much, we risk falling into nihilism, the belief that nothing matters, that the self is just an illusion, that life has no grounding. Nietzsche himself saw this danger. He called it the abyss. And yet, he didn't stop at despair. He challenged us to respond with creativity, to affirm life by shaping meaning where none is given. This is perhaps the most profound response to the paradox. Even if the self is unstable, the act of seeking, shaping, and creating yourself gives life its intensity. Think about your own story. How many times have you changed in ways you never expected? Maybe you once thought you could never leave a relationship, yet you did. Maybe you thought you'd never succeed in a certain area, yet you surprised yourself. Maybe you thought you'd never overcome a fear, yet you found courage when it mattered most. Each of those moments was a transformation, evidence that the self you thought you knew was not the final word. And here is where we arrive at the transformational truth. The paradox of knowing yourself is not a barrier to authenticity, it is the condition of it. Because you cannot know yourself fully, you must live reflectively, courageously, openly. Because you cannot pin yourself down, you are free to grow. Because the self is never finished, you're never finished. And that means life itself remains open, alive with possibility. This realization carries with it a kind of quiet freedom. You don't need to have yourself perfectly figured out to live meaningfully. You don't need to define your essence once and for all. What you need is the courage to reflect, the humility to admit what you do not know, and the willingness to keep becoming. To live as if your life is not a finished sculpture, but a work of art still in progress. There is a phrase in Japanese philosophy, wabi-sabi, which means beauty found in imperfection, transience, and incompleteness. Perhaps self-knowledge is wabi-sabi. You will never fully capture yourself, but the cracks, the changes, the unfinished nature of your identity, these are not flaws. They're the very texture of your humanity. So let me ask you, what unfinished part of yourself are you resisting? What possibility have you closed off because you thought you already knew who you were? What shadow are you avoiding because you don't want to disrupt the story you've been telling yourself? And what would happen if, instead of fearing these contradictions, you welcome them as invitations to grow? Pause with that. Really pause. Because the paradox of knowing yourself is not just a philosophical riddle, it's a challenge to your everyday life. It's the challenge to stop hiding behind, "That's just who I am," and instead ask, "Who might I become?" It's the challenge to face the shadow and find wisdom in what you fear. It's the challenge to live not as a completed story, but as a courageous draft, willing to be rewritten. And if you felt the resonance of this paradox in your own life, if these questions stir something in you, then consider staying with this conversation beyond today. Not because subscribing is a routine gesture, but because these reflections deepen when we share them. Every time you engage, you add to the unfolding story, not just of this channel, but of your own journey. In a world where so many settle for distraction and surface-level living, joining in the search for deeper self-knowledge is itself an act of authenticity. So here we stand. The paradox remains. You cannot fully know yourself, yet you must keep seeking. But far from being a defeat, this is an invitation. Because in the seeking, you discover not a final answer, but the art of becoming. You discover that the self is not a riddle to solve, but a river to enter, a story to live, a canvas to paint. And I leave you with this one question, the question that will linger long after this video ends. If you are always becoming, if yourself is never finished, then what kind of story do you want your life to tell?